All right. This is a little video clip. I don't even know if I want to show it, but I can explain it. Shirley MacLaine, it's a famous scene. She's, of course, into the New Age movement, but she's standing on the beach and she hears from her guru friend, I am God. She's screaming out across the ocean, I am God, I am God. And it's the epitome of, it's just an example as we talked about last week, David's encounter with Goliath, right? I just want to remind us of the foundation of that battle. And really, I think I talked about it with regards to, going all the way back to Genesis and what Moses originally taught with regards to the image of God bearing role that we have as humanity. So to bear the image of God, to carry his name and his reputation. We're representing God, right, as little kings. And so as image bearers, we bear his name, his reputation, and when we do that, we keep him on the throne as king, God as king, right? And part of the rebellion, part of what we see is, this slow erosion that takes place. From the very beginning, Genesis 3, we read earlier about the rebellion where Satan hates that activity happening in humanity. He despises the fact that we can represent his name in the fullness of his reputation as individuals, as members of the human race. So he seeks to destroy that, Satan does, through all the various, his creative ways, his creative means. So he wants to destroy the name and reputation of Yahweh, the Lord, also, whether he figures out a creative way of ending the life of humanity or individual human beings and all of that. So we talked about that a little bit in our discussion of how do we figure out and try to understand more fully the conflict in, the First Samuel text. There's this spiritual battle that's going on. This is a real battle with real casualties, sin and its effects, the fallenness of humanity, and we're going to see all kinds of conflicts taking place. So what we saw last week when we talked about the conflict with David and Goliath represents, not only is he I would argue, a distant relative of the Nephilim, but he's representing also a particular local expression of rebellion against Yahweh, against the Lord. He's defiant. He's mocking the God of the Israelites on the battlefield. And we saw last week, we talked about who has their theology correct. It's David from the town of, remember, that little town, that small town, what did I say? A small town with a big heart, right? You've got David coming out of that faithful community of Bethlehem, knowing his theology, knowing who God is. Yeah, he knows how to take on a lion, tiger, and a bear. He's good with the slingshot. That's where we ended last week. We saw that dramatically portrayed, right? Everybody got a good laugh out of the slingshot guy. But yeah, David knew that. But more importantly, he knew who was going to win the battles for him, and that's the Lord. So he's grown up as a kid in knowing that. So after David's defeat of Goliath, now we start to see in the life of David. Now let's move on in 1 Samuel. Early military success for King David. And what we saw, this is going to be a long process where, let me erase this. And we drew this picture up. What we see from this point on, as we finish 1 Samuel and move into 2 Samuel, and then into 1 Kings, Saul is on the decline and David is on the the incline. And this is basically what we're going to start to see. So in these early chapters, let's turn over to 1 Samuel 18. And let's see, Thomas is not here. Let's have, let's see, Joel up here in the front. Could you read for us chapter 18, verses 1 through 4?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would let him go no more to home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David and his garments, even to his sword and to his bow and unto his girdle.
And in this Old Testament context, remember, love in this context means loyalty. So when a king or two friends would come together, this love means loyal, the expression of loyalty, and that's what we see going on here. David's also going to verse 5. David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he prospered. And Saul sent him over the men of war, set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Then what we see is a lot like what we saw last night with Justin Timberlake, Super Bowl halftime show, one of the best ones of all time. Chapter 18, verse 6 through 9. Let's, Weston, could you read that for us, 6 through 9.
As the troops were coming back, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, with shouts of joy, and with 3-stringed instruments. As they danced, the women sang, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Saul was furious and resented this song. They credited tens of thousands to David, he complained, but they only credited me with thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul watched David jealously from that day forward.
So that one little verse there sets kind of the thesis for the next, the coming chapters, because what we're going to see is this ongoing struggle between two kings. Saul as he continues to de-authenticate himself, and David as he continues to authenticate himself as king. And it's interesting, we won't cover some of the details here, but David has his chance to kill Saul. You're probably familiar with some of those accounts, right? But David, in response, he just continues to be consistent with who he is as a wholehearted king. He's going to demonstrate extreme loyalty to King Saul, sparing his life twice, I think, through that whole text. So chapters 20 through 27, David's fleeing Saul, and we see example after example take place with regards to Saul's suspicion of King David. So David's going to be fleeing for his life. What's interesting is David's early conflict with the Philistines takes an interesting twist. So a little bit later on we see, let's turn fast forward to chapter 27 in 1 Samuel. After the death of Samuel, we see in chapter 27, verses 5 through 7. Let's see here. Christina, over here, could we have you read in chapter 27, verse 5 through 7?
Then David said to
Achish,
if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the king of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory a year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the...
That's good. You can stop there. So it's interesting. Achish is the son of the king of Gath, and this king's going to assign David and his mighty men their own city, Ziklag, in the Philistine territory to live in. So if we fast forward now, over in chapter 30, we see a significant event take place with regards to this situation. So and here we have the Amalekites, right? Interestingly. What did I say earlier about the Amalekites? Always showing up in opposition to God's divine agenda. Here we have in chapter 30, the Amalekites in verse 1. It happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. They took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, as hostages, and carried them off and went their way, probably with hopes of earning a little gold or ransom. And when David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and sons and their daughters had been taken captive. And David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Well, this is a crisis for the king. We've seen David in situation after all kinds of various situations with regards to him showing up with his whole heart. And this is going to be a crisis. What happens, it's a crisis on multiple levels. What happens if David's fighting men institute a coup and take him out? David needs, we don't know yet what's going to happen to David, something pretty significant. But this is a pivotal moment for the anointed king of Israel, and he's at the risk of losing everything. And here in verse 6, what happens? How does a good king respond? A wholehearted king. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. So David fled to hide, to run away. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's not what it says, right? Here's how a wholehearted king responds. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. There's a wholehearted king for you. Wholehearted kings show up, and that's where we see King David. And that's the appropriate response. David is, after this, able to rally his men and rout the Amalekites and then restore the families to, particularly to his men. So this is another validation event for King David. In contrast, and in the meantime, to David, we see just the opposite happening with Saul. And what we see here, let's turn to 1 Samuel 28. I'm going to cover this just a little bit here. Saul's inattention, in a way, to listening to the voice of the Lord. This is another one of those difficult passages. So Saul is going to summon the Lord through, let's see what we have here. He's going to consult a witch with an attempt to try to listen and hear the voice of the Lord with regards to the conflict with the Philistines. Let's take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 5 through, we don't want to look at the whole thing here, but it's just in that context. Well, let's look at a little bit of it here. So Saul saw the camp of the Philistines. He was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. We just contrast Saul with David in a lot of these contexts. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servant said to him, "Behold, there is a woman who is the medium at Endor." So what eventually is going to happen, we see some unusual thing. But what's wrong with this text? How is a king supposed to hear from the Lord? Through prophets? Yeah? And we can remind ourselves of Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20, of what Moses had taught with regards to the kind of king in Israel. Chapter 17, 14 through 20. Here we go. That last part of it down in verse 19. And it shall come about, it shall be with him, verse 18. Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he, the king, shall write for himself a copy of this Torah, right? Remember that? On a scroll, and in the presence of the Levitical priest it shall be with him. He shall read it all of his days of his life, and that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of the Torah and all of these statutes. Why? So that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right, to the left, in order that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. That's another way for a king to hear from the Lord, is from his word, right? And that's what we have there. So how we interpret this, it's interesting. what happens in this case, I think, when Saul resorts to pagan means, this is what a pagan king would do, to try to manipulate the gods, to hear from them or whatever. What happens when he stops hearing from the Lord? We have a question?
What reference was that?
That was Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20. Yep. And when the Lord wants to be heard, it's interesting that the Lord can convey his word through sometimes unconventional means. So it's not too far removed from the situation where the Lord spoke through a donkey. I think of that. I'm reminded of that when the Lord was trying to speak in that situation through in the Balaam-Barak situation there back in Numbers. But here's an ironic twist in this particular account. The Lord actually allows Saul to hear from the prophet Samuel in this case, which is really interesting. And it ends up being one of the few times that Saul ever listened to Samuel, to what he had to say. And ironically now, Samuel's getting Saul's attention through the activities of a pagan witch in Endor. So it's just really a kind of an interesting context, interesting account. So that's what we have. So Saul's going to respond to the message of Samuel down here in verse 15 through 20. So Samuel says to Saul, in verse 15 in chapter 28, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I'm greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me and answers me no more, either through prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may make known to me what I should do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since Yahweh, the Lord, has departed from you and has become your adversary? And the Lord has done accordingly as he spoke through me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David." So it's interesting what he ends up hearing with regards to this particular passage. And down in verse 20, Saul immediately fell. And really in the Hebrew, it's kind of interesting. Remember earlier I talked about Saul being the tall king from a tall city, Gibeah? And here he is falling, and the Hebrew says, in the fullness of his tallness, Saul falls. That's interesting, isn't it? If you connect that back to the idea of him, the whole reason for him being selected as king, Samuel goes out and finds a tall king in a tall town. So he's falling now in the fullness of his tallness. The Hebrew says the fullness of his height there in verse 20. So Saul falls in his tallness. And this will eventually, if we turn over to chapter 31, I'm stringing this together in kind of a way that might help you preach this. In chapter 31, we have the final end. Chapter 31, verse 8. Well, here we are in the battlefield, verse 6. Saul died there with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all of his men on that day together. And when the men, verse 7, of Israel, who were on the other side of the valley, with those who were beyond the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and lived in them. And it came about on the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on the mount of tallness. It's that Hebrew word Gibeah that means to be high, or the idea of height. So it's interesting. And they cut off his head and stripped him of his weapons and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines. So Saul's death is tragic. And what we have here is we transition to 2 Samuel. We just turn the page because in the original book of Samuel, it was one continuous account, probably separated at this juncture because of scroll length, in terms of the scrolls that were copied to warehouse the books, the book of Samuel into 2 parts, just because it's a pretty big book. And then when David learns of Saul's death in 2 Samuel 1, we see that in beginning in verse 5. Let's see here. Let's have Christopher, could you start reading for us in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 5?
2 Samuel?
2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 5. Yeah, sorry.
So David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" The young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. When he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I said to him, he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' Then he said to me, 'Please stand beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me because my life still lingers in me.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord."
Keep going. Yeah.
Then David took all his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who told him, "Where are you from?" And he answered, "I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite." Then David said to him, "How is it that you are not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And David called to one of the young men and said, "Go, cut him down." So he struck him and he died. David said to him, "Your blood is on your own head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed."
So it's interesting that involves another one from the Amalekites, in this case, bringing the news to David and the details of the battlefield in this particular case. But what's interesting is how David's responding to the death of Saul. So you know that he laments over the death of Saul, and that we see here in the next section here. He writes the lament here for both Saul and Jonathan in chapter 1, and it starts there in verse 19. So in thinking in terms of David as a songwriter, he's using music, in this case you worship leaders out there, to help his kingdom, in this case, respond properly to situations like this. So here he's writing a lament to help the kingdom properly mourn the loss of King Saul, in this case, instead of holding a celebration. So King David, he's consistent to the end with regards to his response, his loyal response to King Saul. Here we have our deep thought picture for the break. See it? 2 Samuel. And the wholehearted king, King David. Of course, he's a musician. He's playing. What did your translation say? The three-stringed? Somebody read a passage, the three-stringed instrument? Yeah, some of those Hebrew words are kind of tricky to exactly translate. I think David probably played a 12-string guitar. That's what I think. So that's my translation. So finally, David, the wholehearted king, now the sole king over Israel. And here in chapter 2, we see the early kind of the political implications of this starting to fall out. So let's take a look at chapter 2, and we find that not everybody in the kingdom is excited or absolutely joyful or happy about King David becoming king. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, let's see, Joe, back here. Could you read for us in chapter 2, verse 1 through 7?
After this, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up between any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "To which shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal and Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, every one with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. For they told David it was the men of Jabesh-Gilead who buried Saul. David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead and said to them, "May you be blessed by the Lord, because you showed disloyalty to Saul, your Lord, and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you, and I will do good to you, because you have done this good."
Okay, let's just pause there. One thing I want to notice here in this, the making of David as king, notice in verse 4, who's mentioned and who's not mentioned. You see there's a little bit of a spike in some clues that the author is giving us. David was made king over the house of Judah, right? So you've got Judah, and in this case, the locale of Judah is one of those the southern border portion. You've got other tribes that are not mentioned, right? The northern tribes of Israel are not mentioned in this particular case. So this is not going to be fully, there's something going on here that, the majority of the people are not receiving this yet. So where is this going to lead? And in the early parts of this, we've got the details given to us immediately in verse 8. So here's the aftermath, right? Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, whose name means man of shame, who's Saul's son, brought him over to Mahanaim and made him king over Gilead and over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and even over all Israel. So that's the northern territories, right? Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel and was king for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So in these early days, as David's king, he's not fully king over all of Israel. So there's this early division that we see. And this eventually leads to the civil war that you see that takes place. And in chapter 3, the aftermath, verse 1, there was a long war between the house of Saul, which is representative of those northern tribes, and the house of David, of course, the tribe of Judah. David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew continually weaker. And that's in chapter 3, verse 1. But back in chapter 2, we see the civil war is taking place between Abner, the son of Ner, who went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon with the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and then Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out to meet them at the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. So this skirmish takes place between the two military commanders, Abner for the house of Saul and Joab for the house of David. And after a series of events, we see the tragedy take place. Abner and Ishbosheth are assassinated. And then we finally see in 2 Samuel chapter 5, let's look at that and see. Lauren, could you read for us chapter 5, verses 1 through 5?
And all the tribes of Israel came to David and one said, Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king of Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years.
And at Hebron?
And at Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years.
So what's important in this passage is that we see finally the reference here to all of the tribes, all of the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. So, but with this division, we've already got this little blip, this division now. That's eventually we're going to see this come back when we see the divided kingdoms. That's just a precursor to more that's going to happen down the road. We're going to see in the early chapters here of 2 Samuel, David's going to get to work right away. And in a very significant act, one of his first things that he does now after being declared king over all of Israel is going to take the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites. And we see the details of that in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 through 10. Let's take a look at that, and let's see here. Brad, could we have you read there?
6 through 10?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, and the inhabitants of the land who said to David, You will not come in here, but the blind and lame will ward you off. Thinking, David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from Milo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him.
Okay, so there's a reminder from the author. The Lord is with him. You know, we've seen that language before. We looked at Joseph in Egypt. The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. This is good, right? But what about verse 13? What do we see going on there? Meanwhile, back at the ranch, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. Now, you know, let's be fair to any ancient king. Having sons was the insurance policy of the day. You'd want a lot of sons. That would guarantee if you accidentally were taken out on the battlefield, you'd have a king to take your place with no awkward transition. Your household was protected at that point. On the other hand, we have the instructions from Moses, right? Deuteronomy 17, right? 14 through 20, verse 17 that talks about the idea that a king in Israel is not to amass wives for himself. So that's possibly, I don't know what's behind this, taking more concubines and wives. We don't see any evidence that it's the direct result of David entering into covenant arrangements with other nations. So this may not be directly resulted to the exchange of women that would take place when covenants were made king to king. So maybe we can let David off the hook, right? Maybe we're being a little bit too mean in the early stages. I don't know. All right. So David's going to continue to listen to the Lord. He's going to be granted ongoing military victories as he advances. One way to think about it, so for example, in chapter 5, verse 23, let's take a look at that. When David inquired of the Lord, he said, he's listening, he's inquiring of the Lord. The Lord gives him military instructions. You shall not go directly up, circle behind them, and come down in front of them, in front of the balsam trees. And it shall be when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, you shall then act promptly, for the Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines. So David did just as the Lord commanded, and struck down the Philistines from Geba as far as Gezer. So this ongoing, David's listening to the Lord. He's consulting the Lord. The Lord's granting him early military victory. This is all good. David's expanding the boundaries of the kingdom, which were still, you might say, leftovers from the dark days of the judges. Remember the unconquered territories of what Joshua wasn't able to do in the complete conquest. So this is evidence of the ongoing skirmishes that we saw all through the book of Judges. And now we've got David kind of continuing the cleanup work, getting the boundaries out to where they should be, expanding the boundaries of the promised land. David's going to show, with the victory over the Philistines, what we're going to see, David's going to show some specific concern for the Ark of the Covenant. And he's going to authorize its return now to the capital city of Jerusalem. So the first attempt is made with somewhat surprising and shocking results, right? Let's take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 6. Look over at verses 5 through 7. So what happens here? Let's have Ji-hun. Could you read for us, please? Thank you.
From 5 to 7.
Chapter 6, 5 through 7. Mm-hmm.
David and all the house of Israel plays music before on all kinds of instruments of firewood, on harp, on stringed instruments, on
or castanets. See, it's just evidence there that David is not only a songwriter, but he's also a band leader. He leads a whole orchestra. So go ahead. I think I'm right there.
On cymbals. When they came to Nachshons, rushing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Then the anger of the Lord arose against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God.
Okay, so how's a wholehearted king respond to this situation? This is kind of shocking that this happens. David became angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" And David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. Thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, to the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom in all of his household. It's just an interesting little window into the day in the life of King David. We can say a few things about this. Should David have known better in terms of being a king to give proper instruction with regards to how this ark should be handled properly? We've seen the ark before being mishandled, right? And what happened? God versus Dagon, the Philistine god, and all of that took place earlier. One of the things that we know, David's 17. David should be in alignment with Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20. So if that's true, David should be very familiar by now with copying the Torah, being familiar with what Moses has taught in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And one of the things that we know, maybe you could make a case, maybe we're being too hard on David, but we know from Numbers chapter 4, the book of Numbers chapter 4, Moses instructs with regards to the Ark of the Covenant, Numbers chapter 4, verse 15. Where are we? Here we go. Verse 4, verse 15. There we go. And when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the holy objects and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is to be set out, after that the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them, so that they may not touch the holy objects and die. These are the things in the tent of meeting in which the sons of Kohath are to carry. Very severe implications for mishandling these instruments, these of worship. And over in Numbers chapter 4, we know that from chapter 4, verse 15, where do we see the details there? Well, it might not be in this verse. I think I mislisted a verse there. But the idea of the ark should have been carried not by hand, but on the long poles or staves. Never, not to be touched, but carried on these long poles. Not to be carried on the back of a cart, for example, in this particular case. So could we make a case here if David had known better the instruction of how this ark is to be properly carried and transported, Uzzah's life would have been spared? I don't know. Are we being too hard on King David?
I think if he touched it, he would have died either way.
Well, they're not supposed to touch it. That's the whole point. Yeah.
Whether you carry it on poles or a cart. He made the mistake of...
Oh, yeah, I know that. And I'm disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, properly carried, properly transported, carried on poles is a more stable of transport than being on a cart. So the whole point of being on a cart is that there's a little bit of more of a risk involved in this thing, needing to be touched. All right. Well, maybe, that's another thing that we can, we're starting to see, David's presented warts and all, like anybody in the Old Testament. We've seen that before, especially if we look at the life of the patriarchs. But let's keep going here and see what happens. So after this 3-month delay, we finally see that the ark is returned to Jerusalem. Let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 6, beginning in verse 12. So the ark's brought to Jerusalem, and it was told King David, "The Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God." And David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And so it was that when the bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed here in this case an ox and a fatling. And David was dancing before the Lord with all of his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. Then it happened as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David that Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So not all is well in the household of King David. But it's interesting, I think in this case we see the whole heart of King David being expressed. He knows that having the ark in its place, we may have a little bit of the importance of the ark having its place in Jerusalem goes all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 12, where Moses says, with regards to the place that he'll choose for his name to dwell, in Deuteronomy chapter 12, but you shall seek the Lord, verse 5, you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God shall choose from all of your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, right? And there you shall come. So the centrality of the location of Jerusalem now will eventually lead to the permanent residence for the tabernacle, then the temple, and the permanent location and place for this particular important implement, the Ark of the Covenant will find its permanent home. So that's significant to King David because he knows that this is also it's historically been linked to the very presence of God in the midst of his people. So this is a significant day, and he's celebrating, he's leading the charge. You might say leading by example. Contrary to his wife, I think coming here, he's properly dressed and all of that. Although I think later she says that he's dancing through the streets naked. Doesn't that come from chapter 6, verse 20? Yeah, over here she says, when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came to meet David and said, how the king of Israel distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids, and one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself, as one who shamelessly uncovers himself. So she is not very happy. But this idea of the loud trumpets, I just have to have a geek moment one more time. I don't know if I've played this for you before, have I? If you've had me before, you've heard this. But whenever we see the loud trumpets, and oftentimes linked to celebrating the presence of the Lord, because we go all the way back to Mount Sinai, when the sound coming from Mount Sinai was the sound of loud trumpets and thunder and some of the things indicating and signaling the very presence of the Lord. It may have sounded something like this. I'm going to turn it up. We'll get in trouble. Probably sounded something like that. Celebrating the presence of the Lord. All right. So when the ark is returned, David makes plans to improve, right? On the Lord's place of dwelling. Up until now, the Lord's been in a portable tent called the tabernacle, a very specially designed, uniquely designed, portable worship center. This is where the Day of Atonement sacrifice took place once a year. The high priest would go back to the Holy of Holies to take care of the sins, speaking of the atonement, and applying the effects of the atonement for the people for forgiveness for sins, but also as a location for where the people would come to deal with personal sins, based on our chart and our discussion earlier. So all of this activity took place. Now, David's concern is the presence of the Lord needs a permanent place. So he's going to express concerns, probably now fully aware of the implications of Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 5 that we read earlier. And if David is living in a palace, he's thinking of himself, why is the Lord still living in a tent? So 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now it came about when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest on every side from all of his enemies, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within tent curtains." And Nathan said to the king, "Go do all that is in your mind, for the Lord is with you." But it came about that same night that the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and say to my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one who should build me a house to dwell in? For I have not dwelt in a house since the day I brought up the sons of Israel from Egypt, even to this day, but I've been moving about in a tent, even in a tabernacle. Wherever I've gone with all the sons of Israel, did I speak a word with one of the tribes of Israel, which I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" So we're going to see this activity of building the soon-to-be temple moved on to David's son Samuel. So let's take a break, and I'll come back and dive into the Davidic covenant. All right, in the all-important 1 Samuel chapter 7. Let's take a 5-minute break.